I never thought that moving out of a neighborhood would feel like plotting a prison break, but that's exactly how it turned out. When I first bought my house in that suburban development tucked neatly behind manicured lawns and rows of matching mailboxes, I thought I was buying peace of mind. I imagined quiet evenings on the porch, the gentle hum of sprinklers misting the grass, maybe even the occasional neighborhood barbecue. What I didn't realize at the time was that I wasn't just buying a house. I was buying into a system, a rigid set of rules enforced by a woman who seemed to think she was the supreme authority over everyone who lived within the gates. The Homeowners Association president, a woman I came to know only as Karen even before I knew her real name, had her hands in everything. She dictated the height of the grass, the shade of beige paint that was allowed for fences, the precise location a trash bin could be placed on collection day. No shrub could be planted, no light bulb changed on the porch without her approval. To most people, it would sound like an exaggeration, but living under her rule felt less like suburban life and more like being under surveillance in a tightly controlled commune. At first, I tried to play along. It was easier to just go with the flow than to cause friction, and I had bigger things to focus on, like getting my work in order, supporting my family, and keeping my stress low. But the longer I lived there, the more I realized that nothing would ever be enough for her. If I trimmed the bushes, she'd point out a stray leaf on the lawn. If I pressure washed the driveway, she'd send a letter about a minor crack in the concrete. She had a way of making every homeowner feel as though their very existence was a violation of some unwritten rule. My breaking point came after years of her constant harassment. But what truly sealed my decision to leave wasn't just her control over the neighborhood. It was the way she went out of her way to make leaving feel impossible. Moving out, as I would later learn, was apparently something that required her personal blessing. When I finally found a new house, far enough away that her shadow wouldn't reach me, yet still close enough to stay near my family, I felt like I could breathe again. The paperwork was signed, the movers were scheduled, and for the first time in months, I felt genuine excitement. But excitement has a way of attracting the wrong kind of attention, and she noticed the moment my routine changed. It started small. She lingered longer in front of my house when walking her little dog, pretending to check her phone while clearly taking mental notes. Then she began showing up unannounced, clipboard in hand, claiming she was conducting routine inspections. She scrutinized the moving boxes I had started collecting in the garage, the vehicles parked out front, even the fact that I had canceled my landscaping service a few weeks early in preparation for the move. It was as if she could smell change in the air and she didn't like it. Still, I pushed forward. My plan was to move out quietly, to load up the moving truck, sign the final papers, and vanish before she had a chance to meddle. It wasn't that I feared her directly. It was more that I knew how much trouble she was capable of causing. She thrived on creating obstacles, and if she learned I was leaving, she'd find some obscure rule to hold me back. When moving day finally arrived, I executed my plan with military precision. The truck arrived early in the morning, the movers worked quickly, and I kept the garage door down as much as possible to avoid drawing attention. I remember feeling a surge of relief as the last box was loaded and I locked the front door for the final time. In my mind, I was free. I imagined myself driving away with nothing but the open road ahead, leaving behind the oppressive walls of the neighborhood and the constant scrutiny of its self-appointed queen. But freedom, as I learned, is never as simple as closing a door. The trouble began within hours of leaving. My phone lit up with missed calls from unfamiliar numbers, followed by a series of increasingly aggressive emails from the HOA board. Each one carried the same thinly veiled message. I was not authorized to vacate the property without approval. According to them, my move constituted a breach of HOA bylaws, and I was subject to fines, penalties, and further legal action. It was absurd. I had sold the house legally, signed all the appropriate documents, and handled every detail through legitimate channels. Yet here they were, claiming that my departure required their permission, as if I had attempted to sneak away in the middle of the night. The emails alone would have been irritating. But what came next crossed the line from annoyance to harassment. That evening, as I unpacked the first few boxes in my new home, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find two uniformed police officers standing on the porch. They explained, with a tone of mild confusion, that they had been called to investigate a potential theft in progress. Someone had reported that I had stolen property from my former residence and fled without authorization. It didn't take much to figure out who had made the call. The officers were polite, even apologetic, once I showed them the paperwork confirming the sale of the house and proof of my new address. They assured me there was no issue, but I could see the awkwardness in their eyes. They knew they had been dragged into something petty, yet they had no choice but to respond. As they left, I felt a familiar mix of anger and disbelief. It wasn't enough for her to make my life miserable while I lived there. She had followed me beyond the neighborhood gates, reaching into my new life to try to pull me back under her thumb. For most people, that would have been the end of it. After all, once the police confirmed there was no crime, logic would suggest the matter should be dropped. But logic had never been part of her playbook. She thrived on escalation, on turning molehills into mountains, and she wasn't about to let me slip away without a fight. The next day, more letters arrived. Certified mail, this time stamped with the HOA's official letterhead. They accused me of violating contracts, abandoning obligations, and creating unrest within the community. They demanded immediate payment of fines and threatened to pursue legal remedies if I didn't comply. It was almost laughable, except for the fact that I knew how relentless she could be. She wasn't interested in money. She was interested in control. I tried to ignore her. I reminded myself that I was in a new home now, outside her jurisdiction, free from her reach. But ignoring someone like her is like trying to ignore a wasp buzzing in your ear. The more you pretend it isn't there, the more aggressive it becomes. The final straw came 3 days later. Another knock on my door, another pair of officers on the porch. This time, the call had been escalated to claim that I was harboring stolen HOA property, specifically landscaping equipment that supposedly belonged to the neighborhood. The officers were patient as I once again showed them proof that I had taken nothing but my own belongings. But it was clear this couldn't continue. She wasn't going to stop, and I couldn't keep wasting my time proving myself innocent of crimes that didn't exist. That was when I made a phone call of my own. My son had always been protective of me, even from a young age. What I hadn't fully appreciated until that moment was just how far his protective instincts could extend. You see, my son wasn't just a man with a strong sense of justice. He was a federal agent, working with the FBI. And while he had always kept the details of his job quiet, he had made one thing clear. If anyone ever crossed the line from nuisance into harassment, I was to call him without hesitation, so I did. I explained everything. The endless emails, the threatening letters, the repeated police visits, all orchestrated by a woman who couldn't stand the idea that I had escaped her control. He listened calmly, his voice steady, but I could tell from the silence that followed that he was taking it seriously. When I finished, he told me not to worry. He said he would handle it. At that moment, I didn't realize just how much weight those words carried. I thought perhaps he'd make a phone call, issue a warning, or find some legal recourse to shut her down. What I didn't know was that he was about to pull a thread that would unravel far more than either of us expected. Because when you dig into the actions of someone who thrives on control, you often find that their need for power hides something deeper, something they desperately don't want uncovered. And that's exactly what my son was about to find out. When I hung up the phone after talking to my son, I felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. On the one hand, it felt good to finally hand this nightmare over to someone who knew how to handle it. For days, I had been swatting at the harassment like mosquitoes, never quite able to get rid of it, just pushing it away long enough to catch a breath before it came back. Now, for the first time, I felt like maybe the swarm would finally be cleared. On the other hand, there was the lingering fear that by involving him, I might be dragging him into something messy, something beneath his pay grade, something he didn't deserve to deal with after years of building a career at the federal level. Still, when your back is against the wall, you lean on the people who have the strength to stand for you. That's exactly what I did. The first sign that things were changing came quickly. Less than 24 hours after our call, I got an email. Not from the HOA, but from my son. It was short and professional, the way he always was when he shifted into work mode. He told me he had reached out to local law enforcement contacts and was already digging into the HOA's structure. He didn't share much detail, but the tone of his words carried a certain gravity, as if he'd already uncovered something that didn't sit right. For me, the harassment hadn't stopped. Karen was still on the offensive. More letters arrived, each more ridiculous than the last. She accused me of abandoning community obligations, disrupting neighborhood harmony, even potentially damaging the property values of surrounding homes by leaving so suddenly. It was laughable, but at the same time exhausting. Every letter came with a new threat: lawsuits, liens, fines that stacked into the thousands. It was the kind of intimidation that wore you down, not because it was legitimate, but because it was relentless. The police visits, thankfully, didn't continue. I assumed that was because my son had already spoken to someone in the department, letting them know the calls were bogus. But Karen wasn't one to give up just because one avenue was closed. She doubled down elsewhere. Neighbors I had once been friendly with started forwarding me bizarre messages she had sent to the community mailing list, claims that I had illegally vacated the property, that I was under investigation, that my move was a sign of suspicious activity. She painted me as some kind of fugitive, a person to be distrusted. It was surreal to read her words, knowing how ordinary my life actually was. I wasn't a criminal. I wasn't hiding anything, and yet here I was being smeared in the court of suburban opinion. For a moment, I wondered if this was her end game all along, not to stop me from leaving, but to ruin my reputation in the process. To make an example of me so no one else would dare defy her authority. That thought alone was chilling. Meanwhile, my son's updates grew more pointed. He never revealed everything, but the hints were enough to paint a picture. He said there were irregularities in the HOA's finances, that Karen had been drawing unusually large sums from community accounts under the guise of maintenance and administrative fees. He mentioned contracts with service providers that didn't seem to exist, payments to companies that were nothing more than P.O. boxes. The more he dug, the more obvious it became this wasn't just about control. This was about money. It explained so much. Her obsession with rules, her need to dominate every detail of the neighborhood. It wasn't just a personality quirk. It was a way to keep people too distracted, too beaten down, to ever look closely at what she was doing behind the scenes. If you were too busy fighting her over the color of your mailbox, you weren't going to notice that thousands of dollars were disappearing from the community budget every month. When my son shared this with me, I felt my stomach twist. Suddenly, all those years of harassment weren't just petty power trips. They were part of a larger scheme. I had been living in a neighborhood where every fine, every threat, every so-called violation was part of a system designed to funnel money into her pockets. And the scariest part? No one had ever stopped her. But now she had made a mistake. By dragging me into her game, by refusing to let me leave in peace, she had brought attention to herself from someone she couldn't bully, someone who didn't scare easily, someone who had the resources to pull apart her entire operation piece by piece. The escalation didn't stop on her end, though. If anything, it intensified. When she realized the police weren't coming anymore, she switched tactics. Strange cars started parking near my new home, lingering for hours with their engines idling. Packages I never ordered showed up on my porch, then vanished before I could even bring them inside. Neighbors in my new community mentioned a woman had been knocking on doors, asking questions about me, pretending to be conducting a background check. It didn't take much imagination to know who it was. Every time something like that happened, I updated my son. And every time, his responses grew shorter, colder, more clipped. It was the tone of someone collecting evidence, building a case. I began to understand something that made my pulse quicken. She wasn't just annoying me anymore. She was committing crimes, harassment, stalking, defamation, fraud, and every step she took made the eventual consequences that much heavier. But Karen was clever in her own way. She hid behind the HOA, letting its official letterhead and bylaws serve as her shield. She wrapped her personal vendetta in layers of bureaucracy, hoping it would confuse or intimidate anyone who tried to push back. She had been doing it for years, and it had worked. Until now. The turning point came one evening when my son called me directly. His voice was calm, but I could hear the undercurrent of urgency. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that I needed to start documenting everything. Every email, every letter, every package, every car parked outside. He said it wasn't just about protecting myself anymore. It was about building a trail, a timeline, a chain of evidence that would be impossible to dispute. So I did. I created folders, scanned documents, logged times and dates. I became meticulous, almost obsessive. Every shred of harassment went into the record. And as I worked, I began to see the bigger picture forming. It wasn't just me. Other neighbors had stories too. Fines that didn't make sense, fees that came out of nowhere, threats of foreclosure over trivial violations. Slowly, a mosaic of her corruption came into focus. Still, there was fear. Every night I double-checked the locks. Every morning I peeked out the window before stepping outside. She was unpredictable, and unpredictable people are dangerous. The strangest part was how quiet the neighborhood itself remained. Most people seemed oblivious to what was happening, too conditioned to question her authority. They saw her as a fixture, like a stop sign or a street light. Annoying maybe, but unavoidable. It wasn't until my son began quietly reaching out, asking the right questions, that cracks started to appear in her facade. People began talking, quietly at first, in whispers and anonymous emails, then more boldly, sharing copies of their own letters, receipts of their own payments, stories of their own harassment. Each one added fuel to the fire, and each one gave my son more ammunition to work with. I realized then that this wasn't just my fight anymore. This was a reckoning that had been waiting to happen for years, and I had simply been the spark that lit it. But Karen didn't go down quietly. She never did. The more cornered she became, the more desperate her tactics grew. And desperation in someone like her was dangerous. The real storm was still coming. The storm finally broke, though not in the way I expected. For weeks, Karen's campaign had been defined by noise, letters, vandalism, whispered rumors that spread like weeds. But as my son's investigation reached its boiling point, her tactics shifted again. The noise gave way to chaos, and the chaos carried the sharp edge of desperation. I first noticed the change in her demeanor through the whispers coming out of the old neighborhood. Friends who still lived there told me that Karen's once pristine image was unraveling. She had always presented herself as the face of order, crisp blazers at HOA meetings, a constant smile stretched thin but unbroken, the self-appointed guardian of property values. Now, they said, her mask was slipping. She snapped at residents in public, accused people of conspiring against her, even shouted at the mail carrier for tampering with official HOA correspondence. It was the behavior of someone under pressure, someone who knew her empire was crumbling. My son confirmed as much. Without revealing too much, he told me the investigation had unearthed damning evidence, paper trails that tied directly to her personal accounts, signatures on fraudulent contracts, withdrawals that aligned perfectly with the inflated fines she had imposed on residents. It wasn't just a matter of negligence or sloppy bookkeeping. It was deliberate, calculated theft, the kind of theft that carried federal consequences. For me, the harassment hadn't stopped, but it had taken on a strange new form. Instead of targeting me directly, she began trying to rewrite the narrative. Fake flyers appeared around the neighborhood accusing me of being under federal investigation. Emails circulated through. Anonymous accounts claiming I had fled in the middle of the night to avoid charges. She was desperate to paint me as the villain, to turn her crumbling reputation into a shield by projecting all her sins onto me. But the smear campaign wasn't working the way she hoped. If anything, it backfired. Neighbors who once feared her began to question why she was so obsessed with me after I had already left. They began to connect the dots, to see that her fury wasn't about preserving community standards but about covering her tracks. The more she screamed about my supposed guilt, the more obvious her own became. The tipping point came one night when I received a call from one of my old neighbors, a woman who had lived 2 doors down from me for years. She had always been quiet, cautious, the type who kept her head down to avoid drawing Karen's ire. But now her voice shook as she told me what she had discovered. Documents stuffed into the HOA office shredder bin, half destroyed, showing massive maintenance fees charged to residents for projects that never happened. She had pulled them out, photographed them, and sent them straight to my son. It was the kind of smoking gun that could dismantle Karen's entire scheme. But Karen wasn't going to let it go without a fight. The very next day, reports began trickling in that she was going door to door in the neighborhood, warning residents not to speak to outsiders. She claimed there was a conspiracy to take down the HOA, that agents were twisting innocent paperwork into criminal allegations. She insisted she was the victim of harassment, that she had been targeted simply for upholding the rules. It was classic projection, a last-ditch attempt to frame herself as the martyr. But beneath the performance, everyone could see the cracks. The confident dictator of the cul-de-sac was gone, replaced by a paranoid figure clutching desperately at her crown. And then, she crossed the line again. Late one evening, I came home to find my driveway blocked by a car I didn't recognize. Inside sat a man I had never seen before, staring straight at my house. When I pulled into the street, he drove off without a word, his headlights disappearing into the night. The next morning, a note was taped to my front door. "You made a mistake." I sent the note to my son immediately. His response was terse, but it carried a weight that made my stomach twist. "This isn't just HOA drama anymore. Stay inside. Don't answer the door for anyone you don't know. We're closing in." For the first time since the nightmare began, I felt real fear. Not the annoyance of petty harassment or the stress of constant threats, but the bone-deep chill of realizing Karen was willing to involve strangers to outsource her intimidation. If she couldn't scare me into silence, she would find someone else who could. But the irony was that her every move only dug her deeper. The FBI wasn't just building a case on financial fraud anymore. They were now looking at harassment, stalking, intimidation, and possible conspiracy. What had started as a suburban control freak's power trip had snowballed into a full-blown criminal investigation. The neighborhood itself became divided. Some residents clung to her, too afraid to let go of the devil they knew. Others began organizing quietly, sharing their own evidence, compiling their own stories. The whispers turned into a chorus, and for the first time, people dared to imagine a neighborhood without her shadow looming over it. I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. Relief that the truth was coming to light, fear of what Karen might do before it was over, and a strange sadness for all the years wasted under her rule. How many weekends had been ruined by her letters? How many families had been drained by her fraudulent fees? How many people had kept their heads down, too afraid to speak? It was all about to end, but endings rarely come quietly. Karen still had cards to play, and she was about to throw them all on the table. The following week, the FBI made its first quiet move. My son didn't give me the details, but I learned from neighbors that federal agents had begun requesting documents from the HOA office. They weren't subtle about it. Word spread fast, and within hours, the entire neighborhood knew something big was happening. Karen's response was immediate. She called an emergency HOA meeting, demanding attendance from every resident. From what I was told, she stood at the front of the community center, ranting for nearly an hour about government overreach and false accusations. She insisted that the neighborhood was under attack, that outsiders wanted to destroy everything she had built. Her voice shook, her face flushed red, and for the first time, people weren't nodding in agreement. They were exchanging uneasy glances, whispering to one another, realizing that the emperor had no clothes. Her kingdom was collapsing, and everyone could see it. But collapsing empires are dangerous. They don't go quietly. They drag everything down with them. As I listened to my son's steady updates, I realized we were teetering on the edge of something bigger than either of us had imagined. This wasn't just about my move or her obsession with control or even the stolen money. This was about a woman who had built her entire identity on domination and fraud, and who would rather scorch the earth than surrender. And deep down, I knew the real explosion was still coming. The collapse of Karen's empire wasn't quiet. It was loud, messy, and terrifying. For years, she had controlled the neighborhood with an iron fist disguised as a clipboard. She fined people into submission, bullied families until they complied, and smothered any spark of rebellion before it could grow. But power built on fear is fragile, and once cracks appeared in her facade, the whole thing began to crumble, and crumble it did, spectacularly. The first signs of her unraveling came in waves of paranoia. Neighbors told me she had begun patrolling the streets at night, flashlight in hand, scribbling in her notebook as if she could document away the FBI's presence. She was seen muttering to herself in front yards, shouting at shadows, accusing delivery drivers of being undercover agents. The once polished image she worked so hard to maintain was gone, replaced by raw, unfiltered panic. But fear made her dangerous. The harassment against me escalated again, only this time it was more brazen. One morning, I stepped outside to find my tires slashed clean through, the rubber shredded in neat, deliberate cuts. Later that week, my power flickered off in the middle of the night. When the utility company checked, they found someone had tampered with the meter box. These weren't acts of petty annoyance anymore. These were calculated attempts to intimidate and destabilize me. Every incident, of course, went straight into the file my son was building. He was meticulous, gathering evidence like a hunter laying traps. He told me little, but I could sense the urgency in his voice. He spoke less like a son comforting a parent, and more like an agent walking me through a protection protocol. His words carried weight. Stay vigilant, document everything, don't engage. Meanwhile, the neighborhood itself was splitting down the middle. Some residents clung to her, unwilling to believe the woman who had controlled their lives for so long was nothing more than a thief. They convinced themselves the FBI was mistaken, that Karen was a victim of some vendetta. But more and more, people began to turn. Whispers grew louder, stories were shared openly, and soon the chorus of complaints drowned out her narrative. The illusion of her control was shattered, and with it, her grip on reality. The tipping point came at what would become her infamous final meeting. She had called an emergency HOA gathering at the community center, insisting attendance was mandatory. Neighbors filed in reluctantly, some out of curiosity, others out of fear of retribution. I wasn't there, of course. I had no interest in setting foot on her turf again. But the stories spread fast, and the scene they described sounded like something out of a fever dream. Karen stood at the front of the room, a stack of papers clutched in her hands, her voice hoarse from shouting. She ranted about conspiracies, about shadowy forces trying to dismantle the neighborhood. She claimed the FBI agents were imposters, that I had paid them to attack her, that the entire investigation was fabricated. At one point, she slammed the papers on the table and screamed that everyone in the room would regret betraying her. Some residents walked out. Others stayed, frozen in disbelief. By the end, even her most loyal followers sat in stunned silence, realizing that the woman they had once feared was unraveling before their eyes. But unraveling doesn't mean harmless. That night, after her meltdown at the meeting, I woke to the unmistakable sound of footsteps outside my window. I pulled back the curtain just enough to see a shadow moving through my yard, a figure, crouched low, creeping toward the side of the house. My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, calling the police with trembling hands. By the time officers arrived, the figure was gone. But in the morning, I found the evidence left behind. Scorch marks near the gas line, as if someone had tried, clumsily, terrifyingly, to sabotage it. This was no longer harassment. This was attempted destruction. My son's reaction was immediate. He told me, his tone sharp and unflinching, that Karen was no longer just a nuisance. She was a threat. And threats, especially ones that cross into violence, trigger responses she could never control. Within days, the FBI moved in, not with sirens or flashing lights, but with quiet, deliberate precision. Agents visited residents, collected documents, interviewed witnesses. The case against Karen was no longer theoretical. It was tangible, real, and imminent. But Karen must have sensed it too, because she lashed out one final time. One evening, as I returned home from running errands, I noticed a car tailing me. At first I thought it was coincidence, but every turn I made, it followed. My chest tightened as I pulled into my driveway, the car idling at the curb. For a long moment it sat there, headlights glaring into my rearview mirror. And then slowly, it rolled away. When I stepped out of the car, I saw it. Another note, wedged under my wiper blade. 4 words, scrawled in jagged ink. "You will pay." I sent the note to my son immediately. His reply came quickly, and it carried a finality I hadn't heard before. "It's over. Stay put." And in that moment, I knew the reign of the neighborhood queen was ending, and the curtain was about to fall. The end, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. For weeks, the pressure had built like a storm cloud over the neighborhood, heavy and oppressive, waiting for the lightning strike that would finally split it open. Karen had lashed out with every weapon in her arsenal: letters, fines, vandalism, intimidation, even outright sabotage. But none of it had been enough. The walls were closing in, and she had run out of places to hide. The final unraveling began early one morning. I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at the growing stack of evidence folders I'd compiled, when my phone buzzed. It was a message from my son. Just 2 words. "It's happening." I didn't know exactly what that meant, but my instincts told me to stay put. Outside, the neighborhood looked calm. The same rows of houses and neatly trimmed lawns that had once seemed so suffocating. But beneath the surface, something monumental was shifting. From what I later learned, the FBI executed their move with surgical precision. Agents arrived quietly, unmarked vehicles rolling into the old neighborhood at dawn. There were no sirens, no dramatic announcements. Just calm, deliberate efficiency. They approached the HOA office first, securing records before anyone could destroy them. Then they went to Karen's house. The neighbors who witnessed it told the story in hushed voices later, like they had seen a ghost. Karen had come to the door in her usual blazer, clutching a folder of papers as if her printed rules could protect her. She tried to argue, to wave her bylaws in their faces, to insist she was the victim of harassment. But her words carried no weight anymore. The agents didn't flinch. They had evidence, warrants, and authority she couldn't bully or intimidate. When they placed her in handcuffs, the neighborhood fell silent. For the first time in years, there was no barked command from her, no shrill lecture about property values or lawn heights. Just the sound of the woman who had ruled with fear being escorted into a waiting vehicle. I wasn't there to see it, but the image burned itself into my mind as neighbors described it. The queen of the cul-de-sac, dragged from her throne not by angry villagers but by the weight of her own corruption. The aftermath rippled through the neighborhood like shock waves. For some it was relief. People who had lived under her thumb for years finally felt the weight lift. For others it was disbelief. How could the woman who had dictated their lives with such confidence be nothing more than a thief and a bully? The details of the charges became public soon after. Embezzlement, fraud, conspiracy, harassment. The list was long, each count tied to years of deceit and intimidation. The financial records told the story clearly. Hundreds of thousands of dollars siphoned away through fake contracts and inflated fees. She hadn't just abused her power, she had built her entire life on it. For me, the relief was immediate but bittersweet. On one hand, the nightmare was over. No more letters, no more notes, no more shadowy figures lurking in the night. The threat that had followed me from one house to another was gone, dismantled by the truth. But on the other hand, I couldn't help but think about all the years wasted, all the families hurt, all the stress and fear she had caused. Justice doesn't erase the scars, it just makes sure they stop spreading. My son, of course, remained steady throughout it all. He never gloated, never spoke with vindication. To him, this wasn't personal, it was the job. Another case closed, another fraudster brought down. But I knew deep down that this one had been different for him. He hadn't just protected the law. He had protected me. And for that, no words would ever be enough. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood began to rebuild. Without Karen at the helm, the HOA restructured, residents electing a new board that promised transparency and fairness. For the first time, people felt they had a voice. Barbecues returned to backyards, kids played freely on the streets, and the air itself seemed lighter. The fear that had once lingered in every trimmed hedge and painted mailbox was gone. I watched from afar, grateful that I no longer lived within those walls, but relieved for the people who still did. They had been prisoners of her tyranny, and now they were free. As for Karen, she faded into the headlines for a brief moment. Local news stations covered her arrest, detailing her crimes with the sensational flair that suburban scandals always attract. For a time, she was the talk of the town, the cautionary tale whispered at neighborhood gatherings. But soon, as always happens, the world moved on. She became just another face in the endless parade of mugshots, a reminder that power built on lies always crumbles. And me? I finally found the peace I had been searching for when I first decided to move. My new home felt like a sanctuary now, no longer tainted by her reach. The mailbox stood unbothered, the lawn grew without judgment, and for the first time in years, I could sit on the porch without looking over my shoulder. Looking back, it was almost surreal to think that it had all begun with something as simple as moving out without her permission. What she saw as defiance had been nothing more than me choosing freedom. But that small act had pulled the thread that unraveled everything she had built. She had called the cops to scare me. She had tried to control me even as I walked away. But in the end, all she did was expose herself to a truth she couldn't escape. And thanks to my son, the federal agent who never hesitated to step in when I needed him most, the truth was louder than her lies could ever be. The HOA queen was gone. The neighborhood was free, and I was finally blessedly at peace.